35 years of marriage, and I heard it all from behind a shelf of antique clocks. I'd gone to Hargrove's watch and clock repair on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The kind of grey Tuesday that settles over Kitchener like a wool blanket, not quite cold enough for snow, not warm enough to pretend otherwise. I was picking up my wife's anniversary gift. A small carriage clock, circa 1940, that I'd brought in 6 weeks earlier to have cleaned and restored. The face had been re-enameled, the hands re-gilded, and I'd asked the owner, a man named Philip, to engrave the back. 35 years. Still keeping time with you. H. Harold. That's me. 62 years old. Retired civil engineer. Bad left knee, decent taste in single malt, and apparently, according to what I was about to hear, a problem I didn't know I had. Philip was behind the counter when I came in, bent over something with a loop screwed into his eye socket. He was 70-something, thick-fingered for a watchmaker, with the kind of slow and deliberate movements that made you trust him immediately. He'd been running that shop on King Street West for over 30 years. Longer than my marriage, almost. He looked up when the bell above the door rang. "Harold," he said. Then he paused. Just a half-second, but I noticed it. He glanced past me toward the window that faced the street, then back at me. "Your piece is ready," he said carefully. "Come around back. I want to show you the engraving before I wrap it." That was unusual. He'd never brought me to the back before. But Philip was an unusual man, and I didn't think much of it. I followed him through the narrow doorway behind the counter, past the shelves of movements and case parts and tiny labeled drawers, into the workshop at the rear. It smelled like machine oil and old wood back there. A single work lamp hung over the bench, 2 stools, a clock radio playing something from CBC that I couldn't quite make out. Philip picked up the carriage clock from the velvet pad where it sat and handed it to me. The engraving was perfect. Clean italic script, just as I'd asked. Then he said quietly, not looking at me, "Your wife is outside. She's about to come in. She doesn't know you're here." I stared at him. "She's been in twice in the past month," he said, "with a man I don't recognize. They stood out front for a while last week. I don't know what's going on. But I thought you should know before she walks in." He pulled a stool out from under the bench and set it beside the shelving unit that formed a partial wall between the workshop and the front of the store. "You can hear from here. You can't be seen." I didn't move for a moment. I remember the clock in my hands feeling very heavy. "Philip, I might be wrong," he said simply. "I hope I am." He went back out front. I sat down on the stool in the shadow of that shelf, and I held my wife's anniversary gift in my lap, and I waited. She came in 40 seconds later. I recognized her voice before she finished her first sentence, that particular warmth she uses when she wants something, the one I used to think was only for me. "Philip, hi. I was hoping to catch you." A pause. "Is my husband here?" "His car isn't outside." "Haven't seen him today," Philip said. Not a lie. He hadn't seen me outside. Good. Another pause, and then the sound of the door opening again, and the second pair of footsteps. A man's footsteps, heavier than hers. "He said he's not here," my wife said. And then a voice I recognized. My former business partner. A man I'd known for 22 years. A man who'd been best man at a colleague's wedding where I'd first introduced him to my wife. A man who'd sat at my kitchen table for more dinners than I could count. His name was Stuart. "Good," Stuart said, "because we need to figure out the timeline." I pressed my back against the shelving. The clock radio was still murmuring from somewhere. My heart was doing something unpleasant and rhythmic against my sternum. "The firm's Q4 review is in December," my wife said. "If the partnership dissolution goes through before then, the asset split would be based on the October valuation." "Which favors us," Stuart said. "If we wait until January, the Waterloo contract bumps the value. Harold keeps more, so it has to be filed before November 30th. I sat with that for a moment. The words moved through me slowly like something very cold. Let me explain something. Harold Fenchurch and Associates is not a large firm. It is not a corporation or a conglomerate. It is an engineering consultancy I built over the course of 30 years, starting with one contract from the region of Waterloo and a second-hand drafting table in our spare bedroom. My wife, I kept calling her that in my head, even then, even in that moment, had been the firm's bookkeeper for the first 11 years, before we'd grown enough to hire someone full-time. She knew every clause of the partnership agreement Stuart and I had signed in 2003. She knew the valuation schedule. She knew exactly when to move. He's going to contest it, my wife said. You know that. Let him. The partnership agreement is airtight. If he dissolves or we do, the buyout formula is fixed. He can't change that. He'll try to renegotiate. He's not going to see it coming, Stuart said. He thinks everything is fine. He thinks everything is fine. I had thought everything was fine. 3 weeks earlier, I had sat across from Stuart at a Crew brasserie on King Street for his birthday lunch, and I had paid for his steak and his scotch and his creme brulee, and I had told him that I was looking forward to our anniversary trip in January, a cruise my wife had been planning, and he had smiled and said it sounded wonderful, and he hoped we had a great time. I sat in the back of Philip's shop and I thought about that lunch, the particular quality of his smile, how he'd clinked his glass against mine. What about the house? Stuart asked. Harold owns the house. It was his before we married. I don't have claim to it. The RRSPs split. I'm entitled to half of anything accumulated during the marriage. That's enough. That, plus the buyout from the firm. It's enough, my wife said. It's more than enough. There was a silence then. The comfortable kind. The kind between two people who have had this conversation many times. I just want it done, my wife said. I'm tired. And her voice in that moment was something I had never heard before. Not the warmth she used when she wanted something, not the competence she used when she was working through a problem. Just tired. Genuinely tired. Like she had been carrying something for a long time and was ready to set it down. I don't know why that was the hardest part. It shouldn't have been. But it was. They left 6 minutes later. I know because I was watching the second hand on the carriage clock in my lap. Philip came to the doorway and looked at me. He didn't say anything. How long have you known? I asked. I suspected. Since September. He paused. I didn't want to say something and be wrong, but then she came in last week and they were talking outside, and I heard her mention Q4. I know what you do for work, Harold. Why didn't you call me? He was quiet for a moment. I didn't want to call you. I wanted you to hear it yourself. He said this without apology. So you'd know, and so you'd have time to think before you reacted. I looked down at the clock. 35 years, still keeping time with you. Hayes, can I use your phone? I asked. He handed me the shop phone without asking who I was calling. I called my accountant first. Then I called my lawyer, a woman I'd known since our boys were in minor hockey together and whose number I happened to know by heart. I told her I needed 40 minutes of her time as soon as possible and that it was not a social call. She said she had 45 minutes at 4:30 if I came to her office. I said I'd be there. I set the phone down on the bench and looked at Philip. What do I owe you? I said. For the clock. 160, he said. But don't worry about it today. I'll worry about it today. I'll worry about it today. I'll worry about it today, I said. I took out my wallet and paid him. Then I picked up the clock. Thank you. He nodded once. I'm sorry, Harold. Don't be. I'd rather know. I drove to my lawyer's office with the carriage clock on the passenger seat. It ticked quietly the whole way there. What she told me in those 45 minutes changed the direction of the next 4 months of my life. The partnership agreement Stuart and I had signed in 2003 contained a standard buyout clause based on a fixed valuation formula, revenue multiple, asset inventory, client contracts in good standing. My wife had known this since we signed it. She'd been in that room. She'd reviewed the document. She knew that if dissolution was filed before the Waterloo Regional contract was added to Q4 accounts, Stuart's buyout payment to me would be significantly lower than it would be in January. What she didn't know, what I hadn't thought to mention because it hadn't been relevant until now, was that the Waterloo contract had already been signed and invoiced in October. The payment had come in the previous Friday. It was sitting in the firm's operating account. It was already in the Q4 numbers. My lawyer spent 20 minutes going through the agreement with me line by line. Then she said, carefully, "Harold, if you were to formalize the partnership dissolution yourself, before Stuart does, and if you were to use the actual Q4 numbers as of today's date, the formula would yield a very different figure." I asked her how different. She showed me on her legal pad. I sat with that for a long moment. "How long do I have?" I asked. "If you want to beat whatever they're planning for November 30th, you have about 3 weeks. But we'd need to move quickly on several things." "What things?" "The firm's intellectual property, project files, client relationships, proprietary methods, needs to be clearly assigned to you as the founding partner. We should also look at whether the client contracts are with the firm as an entity or with you personally." I knew the answer to that one. I had made a point years ago of ensuring that certain key clients retained me personally, not the partnership. It had been a business decision, not a strategic one. Or so I'd thought at the time. "Then we have more leverage than he's counting on," she said. I nodded. I picked up the carriage clock from where I'd set it on the corner of her desk. I turned it over and read the engraving on the back. 35 years. Still keeping time with you. I thought about what I was going to do with this object now. I'd had it made in late September before any of this. Before Philip's shop. Before a grey Tuesday in October that rearranged the furniture of my entire life. I set it back down. "Let's start," I said. Over the next 3 weeks, I did not confront my wife. I did not call Stuart. I did not change the way I moved through our house or sat at our dinner table, or mentioned the anniversary trip we were supposedly planning for January. I want to be honest about that period, because it is the part I am least proud of and most grateful for at the same time. I was operating in a kind of strange, focused calm that I don't fully understand even now. My lawyer and accountant moved quickly. We formalized the assignment of intellectual property to me personally. We confirmed that 11 of the firm's 16 active clients had contracts with me by name, not with the partnership entity. We prepared the dissolution notice. On November 14th, 2 weeks before my wife's planned timeline, my lawyer filed the paperwork. Stuart received the notice that evening. He called me the next morning. He didn't say he was surprised. He said he thought we should talk. I said I agreed. We met for coffee, not group brasserie at Tim Hortons on Highland Road, and I watched him recalibrate in real time, trying to understand how I'd known, what I knew, how much. I didn't tell him. I didn't need to. The buyout formula, applied to the actual Q4 numbers, yielded a figure that was fair, not punishing. I hadn't wanted to punish him. I just wanted what was accurate. He signed 2 weeks later. My wife came to me on a Sunday evening in late November. She sat across from me in the living room and she was very still and very composed. And she said that she thought we needed to talk about our marriage. She said she'd been unhappy for a long time. She said she had feelings for someone else. She said she had feelings for someone else. She said she was sorry for the way she'd handled things. I listened. I didn't perform shock. I didn't perform anger, though the anger was there. Had been there since October, a low, constant heat that I'd learned to sit beside without being burned by it. When she was done, I asked one question. "Did you think I wouldn't find out about the filing plan?" She went very quiet. "The November 30th timeline," I said. "The October valuation. Stuart's buyout." She didn't ask how I knew. I'll give her that. She just looked at me for a long moment, and then she looked down at her hands. "I handled it badly," she said. "Yes," I said. "You did. We hired separate lawyers. The divorce was not uncomplicated, but it was not a war either. The house was mine, as she'd acknowledged in Philip's shop. The RRSPs were split. She received a modest settlement, which my lawyer had negotiated carefully and which I considered fair, given the circumstances. Stuart and his buyout were a separate matter entirely, and by the time divorce proceedings began, that chapter was already closed. I won't pretend the months that followed were easy. They weren't. 35 years leaves a particular kind of imprint on a life, in the shape of a house, in the habits of an evening, in the particular silence of a kitchen where someone used to be. I ate a lot of soup that winter. I called my sons more than I had in years. The older one drove up from Toronto one weekend and we watched 3 hours of hockey and said almost nothing, and that was exactly right. In the spring, I went back to Hargrove's watch and clock repair. Not for a job, just because I found myself walking past it one afternoon, and I thought about Philip, and I went in. He was behind the counter, as always. "Harold," he said. "Philip," I said. He didn't ask how I was doing in the way that requires a performance. He just looked at me with those careful eyes and waited. "I wanted to bring you something," I said. I set a small box on the counter. He opened it. Inside was a bottle of Lafroig, a good one, the 16-year that I'd been saving for a particular occasion for about 4 years, waiting for the right moment. I decided that this was it. He looked at the bottle for a moment. Then he looked at me. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," I said. He picked it up and turned it in his hands. "How are you?" I thought about it honestly. "Better than I expected," I said. "Worse than I let on. Getting there." He nodded. He set the bottle carefully on the shelf behind him, between a bracket clock and a row of spare movements in labeled bags. "For a good occasion," he said. "Or a necessary one," I said. He smiled at that. A small, unhurried smile, like the movement of a well-made clock. I walked back to my car in the April afternoon. The particular brightness of a Kitchener spring, when the light comes back differently than you remembered and the world seems slightly rearranged. And I drove home to my house. My house. That still takes some getting used to. The weight of a word like that when it means something different than it did. There are things I know now that I didn't know on that grey Tuesday in October when I walked into a watch repair shop to pick up an anniversary gift. I know that the people who protect you sometimes do it quietly in small rooms without announcement. I know that calm, in the face of something that wants to undo you, is not indifference. It is a form of precision. Like a watchmaker working with tools that require a steady hand and a clear eye, and the willingness to sit with something broken for as long as it takes to understand what went wrong. Philip once told me on some earlier visit, when we were talking about nothing in particular, that a clock doesn't stop working when something breaks. It just becomes inaccurate. The mechanism is still running. It just needs to be corrected. I've thought about that a lot this year. Betrayal is not an ending. It is a correction. I think about Philip a lot, still. Not every day, but on the days when something small goes unexpectedly right. When I find a parking spot in a full lot, when my accountant calls with good news, when the light through the kitchen window hits the counter, the way it used to when the house felt like mine alone. I think about what it cost him to do what he did. Nothing dramatic. Just a stool in a back room and a quiet word, "Stay here." That was all. And somehow that was everything. There's a kind of cause and effect in life that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with warning or ceremony. It just accumulates quietly in the choices people make when they think no one is watching, or in the choices they make precisely because someone is. Stuart and my wife had made their choices over months, maybe longer. Small decisions stacked into a plan, and the plan had a logic to it, a cold and careful logic that I had to respect even as it was being used against me. They hadn't been reckless. They'd been deliberate. That's what took the longest to sit with. But deliberate cuts both ways. What I learned that October, sitting in a watchmaker's back room with a carriage clock in my lap, is that the clearest thinking I've ever done in my life happened in the moments when I most wanted to react and chose not to. When I drove to my lawyer's office instead of driving home to confront someone. When I sat at dinner for 3 weeks and passed the salt and asked how the day had gone and held every card I had close to my chest. That discipline wasn't something I was born with. I had to find it under pressure. The way you find out what a material is actually made of, only when you put it under load. My father used to say that a man's character isn't what he does when things are easy. It's what he does in the interval between finding out something terrible and deciding what to do about it. That interval. That's the whole game. I also learned, and this one's harder to admit, that intelligence without honesty is just cleverness aimed in the wrong direction. Stuart was intelligent. My wife had always been sharp with numbers, with contracts, with the geometry of a situation. They used that intelligence to construct something that, for a while, looked unassailable. But it was built on the assumption that I was less informed than I was, less attentive than I was, less prepared than I was. The moment that assumption turned out to be wrong, the whole structure shifted. Not because I outmaneuvered them brilliantly. I just knew my own firm. I just paid attention to what I built. And then there's what I think of as the endurance part. The part nobody tells you about. Winning, if you can call it that, doesn't fix the 35 years. It doesn't give you back the Tuesday evenings or the hockey conversations or the particular warmth of a house where someone who knew you was also home. That loss is real, and it takes time, and there's no tactic or legal strategy that addresses it. You just have to carry it until it gets lighter, which it does. Slowly, the way a bad winter eventually becomes March. I'm not the same man who walked into Hargroves that October afternoon. I'm not sure I'm better or worse. I'm more careful. I'm more grateful for the people who show up quietly and do the right thing without needing to be asked. I'm less surprised by betrayal and more moved by small decencies. The clock is still on my shelf. I kept it. Some days I think that's strange. Most days I think it's strange. Most days I think it makes sense. Time kept moving, so did I.